I was just in Palestine for the first time in 18 years, right before October 7th.
Wow.
I wanted to be the first American Muslim woman to broadcast on American television. It's not a conspiracy. CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, the Washington Post. These are mainstream corporate media outlets that have direct ties to Israel lobby groups. Israel really shot itself in the foot because, Palestine is a red line for Muslims around the world.
Have you ever worked for the big dog?
I got a lot of interesting questions, like, do you have anything strapped under your hijab? These are real questions that I got. He told me that I would never succeed covering war and also wearing the hijab. It's really easy to feel like you're a lone voice. It's as if you're in an abusive relationship with somebody.
I want to end on a very controversial note.
I was kind of pushed in a corner to try to, survive.
Welcome back to TMJ News. I'm Zainab Wrights, and today we're joined by the lovely Mnar Adley from MintPress News. She's the founder and director, and I have the absolute honor to be speaking to her here today at our studio at TMJ News, and I have a lot of questions to ask you. Are you ready?
I think so.
As journalists, you've been doing this for a while. We're pretty new. But I can already tell, you need a lot to get through this. To be journalists, especially in this time, it's not an easy task. We were talking earlier about the thick skin. Can you tell us more about, how much of a thick skin do you need to be a journalist today?
Well, you do need a lot of thick skin. But before I answer that question, I just want to thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here in the TMJ studio in Detroit. I'm a big fan and follower of yours, Zainab. You're an inspiration.
Thank you.
So thank you. We have to remember why we are here doing the journalism that we are doing to expose the war crimes and the profiteers of the permanent war state. And when we get back to our purpose and remember why exactly we are, putting ourselves at the front and center of this information war, sacrificing so much, including our reputation, sometimes time with our family. We just have to remind ourselves, why exactly are we here? If it goes back to our ego and ourselves, then, we're going to get pulled into the throes of the stress and what people think and what people say and the, what's the word that I'm looking for? The judgments.
And that's never ending. Like, people just see, they can judge based on what they see, and they don't see a lot of our personal lives, the things we also struggle with as journalists. And we have to really put that aside to just get our job done. And it does come with a lot of unwarranted baggage. So I just feel like in my personal life has impacted the way I tell stories. Do you feel like that's been the same for you, in the sense of how your life has impacted the way you tell stories?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm Palestinian, I'm American, born and raised in the United States in a post 9/11 world, but I also lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid and experienced war crimes that no child should ever have to experience in their lifetime. And so having been in the Middle East and then also coming back living in the United States as a teenager in a post 9/11 world, having that experience living under apartheid, you could say I was living in survival mode. And so from a very young age, having experienced living under apartheid and seeing Israeli jets drop bombs on homes, living under militarized curfew, watching soldiers, bearing arms, pointing their guns at innocent people, and, crossing through militarized checkpoints and witnessing truly segregation and apartheid firsthand as a child, and then moving back to the United States to live in a post 9/11 world as a Muslim American to watch the media propagandize Americans, dehumanizing billions of Muslims around the world to justify two horrific wars, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that killed over 2 million people each in both of those countries. Two wars that our government committed horrific war crimes in. And just being witness to all of those things was extremely overwhelming. And so the only way that I knew from a young age to process all of that was to share the stories of people living under war. I was a survivor of apartheid, of Israeli apartheid and occupation and settler colonialism. But I was also an American Muslim now living in a post 9/11 world, being presented and treated as an other. And so you could say that I was kind of pushed in a corner to try to, survive, to share the stories of Muslims, of people living under war. And it was a lot to come from that war background, and then also to see on TV the way in which US bombs were being dropped on cities in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to witness the media dehumanize Muslims and Muslim women, saying that they needed to be saved. From a very young age, I saw how the media weaponized human rights, they weaponized democracy, they weaponized, women liberation issues to justify those wars. And so the way that I processed all of this was I found courage and catharsis in my voice, in the fact that I could write and share these stories, and also not just share the stories of people on the ground and humanize them, but also to expose the inner workings and the many conflicts of interest that exist within our corporate media, and their ties to the war machine and weapons manufacturers and lobby groups that profit off of these conflicts, that profit off of the bloodshed of millions of people around the world, and not just from war, but through the sanctions regimes as well, and the targeting of global South countries to extract and exploit their resources. And so that's really where I found my outlet to be, which was through journalism, and to start MintPress at a very young age. And I'm very proud of what we've built. And it's been a beautiful journey. It's been a tough journey, but it's been a great journey, as we are now about, a little over 12 years old now. We're one of the leading independent media outlets in the United States that names the names. We list the profiteers, and we publish investigations exposing these many conflicts.
And you guys started out as independent media with a lot of growing pains that TMJ is now going through. What are some of the challenges that you feel independent media outlets have to overcome, and we're living in the time we're living in today?
Well, it's really easy to feel like you're a lone voice, especially when you are surrounded by a sea of lies that corporate media is spreading every single day. And, today, 70% of Americans don't even trust the mainstream corporate media anymore. And so I saw that as an opportunity, like, okay, now this is an opportunity for us to present an alternative and independent perspective that challenges mainstream media propaganda. But when you get an organization started, you are it feels like the walls are caving in.
Yeah, you're in the trenches, funding, everything's an issue. And you have to really prove yourself to the world, which I think MintPress has done a great job in. But tell me about life before MintPress. What have you ever worked for the big dogs?
Yeah, I did. I started out as an independent journalist when I was at the age of 21 years old for a local news broadcasting in St. Cloud, Minnesota. And it was a really great learning experience because I was a brand new hijabi girl. And I wanted to be the first American Muslim woman to broadcast
Right.
on American television. That was kind of my dream and my vision.
And you were.
And I did.
You were the first.
Yes, I did break that barrier.
Mhm.
But what was interesting about St. Cloud, Minnesota, is that it was a very conservative and right-wing city. And
Okay.
at that time, that was a Michelle Bachmann constituency. And so Michelle Bachmann, if you're familiar with her,
Yes.
you know, she's
Mhm.
very racist,
Mhm.
right-wing, conservative, very much a Christian Zionist. And
Yeah.
so when I was reporting on the ground there, I was the first Muslim that people met. And this was in a post 9/11 America. And so I really had to I felt like I had to prove myself, like, okay, that I can do this and show people what Muslim women were about. And I got a lot of interesting questions like, you know, do you have anything strapped under your hijab? These are real questions that I got. And people were legitimately afraid of Muslims. But what I did learn is that despite those prejudices and preconceived notions, these people were fed a narrative by organizations like Fox News and conservative media. And so they lived in fear. And so I, again, saw that as an opportunity to show them what a Muslim woman was.
In that sense, they're victims of the narrative being fed to them.
Yes. And that was one of the first eye-opening experiences of how media propaganda works on conservatives. And by the time I left St. Cloud, I had made new friends and I had built bridges, and they had said, wow, thank you so much for, you know, teaching us about yourself. And, you know, we're not afraid of Muslims anymore. They said that to me. And that just goes to show, like, you know, in today's world too, it's really important that we try to talk to people that we might think we disagree with, because it is possible to build those bridges. It's the media that distracts and divides us. And it's up to our shared collective humanity to build those bridges and connect with people, to help raise our consciousness and build these connections with our shared humanity.
You know, I started out, as you remember, former life was as an activist. And then during grad school, professors in journalism school would say, well, you can't really bring activism into the journalism world. But now I'm not sure anymore. Do you believe that? Do you think that there is no space for activism in journalism?
So I was also taught that concept as well. And I was
Yeah.
actually told that I would never, I actually was told by one of my professors,
Yeah.
Dr. Cheng, I'll never forget him, Professor Cheng.
You're gonna call him out?
Yeah,
like that?
he told, you know, he was just going based off of his, you know, world experience and worldview, but he told me that I would never succeed with my mission of, you know, covering war and also wearing the hijab, because I wanted to become that first American Muslim woman wearing the hijab in American media. But if we actually look at the definition of journalism as defined by our First Amendment, the way journalism is meant to operate within a democracy, if we are truly to call ourselves a democracy here in the United States, is that we are meant to hold the powers that be accountable. And that's a form of activism. That's a form of activism and watchdog journalism that should be calling out the powers that be that are abusing their power, the corruption, the wars, and bringing that power back to people. So journalism should be a form of information to help them be better informed, I guess you could say, at the voting poll, so we can elect the right people.
That's what they've done. They've usurped this right to, inform the masses of the corruption, the abuse, with mainstream media really taking that monopoly and usurping this right of the people. We've kind of just let that dimension go. And now we're being taught in schools, no, you can't bring in activism. But that's really what it is. Like, even today, we're seeing so much abuse in journalism, the mixing of truth and falsehood. So there is really like that underlying concept in journalism that you might not outwardly be, supporting a call to action, but it does drive you like to kind of, do what's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so today, the way the media consolidation has worked is that, since the 1980s, or before the 1980s, we had over 50 corporations
Yeah.
control and own the media. And since the rise of neoliberalism and privatization, we now have less than 6 corporations that own and control US media, and they are very much intertwined. So we very much have a monopoly of information. And so the powers that be that are meant to be held accountable are by the media are the ones that control and own the media. And so this is something that we work really hard to do at MintPress to expose is, the owners of the media and how they are connected to the ruling military class, weapons manufacturers, think tanks that are funded by NATO, think tanks that are funded by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and others. And sometimes media organizations that are directly funded by foreign interests, like the state of Israel or Saudi Arabia, for example. So we don't have a watchdog media in this country. We don't even have a mainstream media in this country. We have an extremist corporate media beating the drums of war.
And so people think that, there's a liberal media, there's conservative media, and people think that if you're listening to CNN, Fox News, they're all different camps. But it's very easy to tell, their agendas when it comes to foreign policy. There's really no nuance or difference of opinion, right, in their agenda setting.
Yeah, they use identity politics to keep us divided and to create this illusion that we have right versus left or conservative or liberal media. But at the end of the day,
it's all the same.
They promote the same foreign policy, which is war and racism. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Do you think our stories are being told in media now? Like it's 2024. Are we being represented, minorities and even Muslims in general?
I think we're being represented in a way that helps the establishment,
token journalism.
Token journalism, or even, minorities are used to promote corporatism and capitalism. And we have to really be careful of that. That's where Muslims are being used the most. But the second we speak out against, Israel's war in Gaza, we're being canceled. The second we use our platforms to call out the war machine or capitalism or income inequality or racism, we get canceled. We get deplatformed. We get suppressed. And so that's why it's really important for any people of color or minority or religious person to use their platform and understand that we do live in a capitalist society and we can only say certain things up to a certain point. There's always going to be a limit that we can say and do things for the greater good.
Everything is a chess piece for them, in terms of, especially, I look at mainstream media as like a reflection of the government. What they're very intertwined. Why is Palestine so important to them? In terms of their political agenda, they're obviously been focusing on it quite a bit, and it has gotten coverage, but obviously not in the way that it should. Why is this so important to them?
Well, Israel represents a proxy state for the US military industrial complex. And as Joe Biden has famously said, if there was no Israel, we would create one to exist in the Middle East. It exists there to keep the region divided, to keep the profits fueling the military industrial complex and the weapons manufacturers keeping the profits lined up for them. And so the media that we have today, I mean, it's not hyperbole. It's not a conspiracy. CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, these are mainstream corporate media outlets that have direct ties to Israel lobby groups. I mean, I'll just talk about the New York Times, for example. The New York Times receives gag orders from the state of Israel. I mean, that means that whatever they publish about Palestine and Israel or the crisis there has to be approved by the state of Israel. And the New York Times has been known to be the so-called legacy media outlet in this country. And it represents the interests of a foreign entity, of an apartheid state. And so that should tell us a lot about what we need to know about our corporate media. The New York Times bureau in Jerusalem was built upon stolen Palestinian land. And the New York Times, two bureau chiefs, both of their children served in the Israeli military. And so that just goes to show where their interests are, where their biases are when they are going to report on Palestine and Israel. CNN regularly works with the Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC and other weapons manufacturers and think tanks that are funded by Israel and funded by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And they send out memos on how to report about Israel and Palestine. Whenever talking about the death toll, CNN released a memo. It was actually leaked by one of their employees, one of their staffers, that the CEO of CNN sent out a memo saying whenever we talk about report on the death toll in Gaza, we have to say Hamas-led health ministry. And so this is real, the propaganda.
The subliminal messaging.
Yeah.
And you know, people will cheer. Like there's a couple stories that CNN covered, and the masses were like, wow, you know, you guys are late, but at least you're talking about this. You know, people will cheer these stories and spotlight stories. What do you have to say about that when they're actually featuring Palestinian voices? And is it done in a sinister way, or is it done to confuse the masses?
So I was going to say it is done in a way that is meant to purposely confuse people and to keep us going back to corporate media. It's as if you're in an abusive relationship with somebody.
A toxic relationship.
Yeah, they breadcrumb you.
Yeah.
So corporate media breadcrumbs us all the time with little truths here and there. But in the end, it's a form of soft propaganda. They specialize in keeping the masses distracted and divided. And we will always keep coming back to them because of their tactics. And when they do put out a really great story, for example, the Associated Press just released a story about discrediting some of the major rape allegations.
Is that why their equipment got confiscated?
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, probably. What has it been like reporting on this issue as a Palestinian yourself? Seeing all this trauma and not just now, it's been going on for decades. What's that been like for you?
Well, as a Palestinian, it's been a little bit more personal because I obviously lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid. And in fact, I was just in Palestine for the first time in 18 years, right before October 7th.
Wow.
And things were, you know, at the time a little bit calm. In terms of my trip, it was very calm. And so just to see the war erupt the way it did, was very emotional because I know people personally who have lost their entire families from Israeli bombs in Gaza. So, but, you know, what's happening in Gaza is horrific. And having been covering war for over a decade, we have to remember that what Israel is doing in Gaza is simply an outward expression of US imperialism. It's horrific and it's horrible. And the death toll is just so sad. Over 40,000 people dead. And we don't even know how many more people we haven't even discovered under the rubble. But we have to remember that this is what this is just standard procedure for US imperialism. I mean, the United States killed over 1 million people in Iraq, over 1 million people in Afghanistan. The United States completely destroyed Libya, Somalia. They started a very dirty war in Syria. So what Israel is doing is just standard US imperialism. It's just an outward expression of it. And because we are living in a time of social media, we're getting this genocide broadcasted live on our smartphones, which makes it even harder. But I also have some hope because, you know, we're seeing a tidal wave of change that's happening around the world where people are, for the first time, uniting across political lines, religious lines, sectarian lines for the cause of Palestine. And I think Israel really shot itself in the foot with this because as horrific as this war is, and at times we feel really helpless and hopeless, like how can we stop this? the fruits of our labor as activists and as journalists is really coming to fruition right now, because people that we probably wouldn't even have expected to stand with us are saying enough is enough. I don't want our taxpayer money to go towards this crisis. And then we're seeing little glimpses of hope in terms of the way other countries are responding, like Yemen. I covered Yemen for over a decade.
Yes, that's actually how I became a journalist, is through your coverage of Yemen.
We were one of the, at MintPress
First
and myself, one of the only independent media outlets covering Yemen when there was a media blackout on what was happening in Yemen with the US Saudi-led blockade and genocide, over 23 million people starving. And based on my conversations with my contacts on the ground, the famine crisis in Yemen is actually far worse than it was when I was covering it. And yet every single Friday, millions of people in Yemen are gathering on the streets of Sana'a, and they are, saying that they stand with Palestine. And then they say, bring the war to us. We will stand up. They've imposed a Red Sea blockade, which is massive.
And they're the only, people look at them as, a small underdog, but they've really been a thorn in this whole war on Gaza. And that's actually when I first saw your video ever, was during the time of the war on Yemen. And I remember, I was like, I've never heard this before. What is this really true? And then I went down a rabbit hole, and I'm like, I think I want to be a journalist, because we need more people to really shed light on this. And there was a complete blackout. People didn't even know this was happening in America.
There's been a complete blackout on Yemen and the humanitarian crisis there.
Yeah.
And whenever Yemen was covered, it was through a sectarian lens. That the
civil war, the Houthis,
or the Houthis are backed by Iran or whatever it may be.
And Iran-backed Houthis.
Yep. So it was always through a sectarian lens to keep people divided and to kind of take sides. But in fact, if we look at what's happening in Yemen right now, even, like I said, even because of the war that Israel launched against Gaza and the humanitarian crisis, even forces that were aligned with Saudi Arabia in Yemen have put down their arms and have joined Ansar Allah in this Red Sea blockade of Israeli and US and British ships.
So they united within themselves.
Yeah. So Israel really shot itself in the foot, because, Palestine is a red line for Muslims around the world. And what's really been shameful, though, is just to see the just absolute hypocrisy of these Gulf Arab states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Morocco, Egypt, even Turkey, helping Israel circumvent the Red Sea blockade. What an absolute disappointment.
Yeah.
And they've really come out to show their true faces. Of course, I've known this about them for a long time, but I think for a lot of Muslims who thought that these countries were on the right side of history, they now know that normalization with Israel is more important to them than the lives of Palestine, and more important than Islam itself.
I just want to backtrack to what you said earlier. We're seeing a shift in people's perceptions of Palestine. It's very clear to them, what the different sides are. Everyone's on the same page when it comes to Palestine. But we've also noticed that this is a cause where people are united on, but other causes where US imperialism is also at play, what you spoke about earlier, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, why are they confused about that? And I've noticed that as a journalist, when it comes to whenever we'll cover that, or we'll bring up that, Syria is also a supporter of the Palestinian resistance. It's like news to people. It's very new. It's news to people that, the Gulf monarchs are, moving forward with normalization, and they're not really following the will of the people who are very much in support of Palestine. Why is this such a new concept to people?
Well, we have to look back at the way in which wars were sold to the public under the Obama administration. And it was always through a humanitarian lens. Human rights, democracy were weaponized, and people's emotions were being used to take sides in these conflicts. And especially in the West, people were pulled through this sectarianism to support certain sides of the war. And Muslims were a victim of this propaganda. I mean, and we at MintPress we were bringing attention to this. But when the U.S. launched its dirty war in Syria to fund and arm, terror groups and jihadis like the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, and even ISIS, through the help of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and indirectly Israel and Israeli Mossad, people fell for that sectarianism. But what really brought people to understand now, nearly a decade later, that war was based on lies and that sectarianism was used to divide us, is Israel's war in Gaza today. It helped expose the moral depravity of the so-called neoliberal and war class that have used sectarianism to keep us divided. And so people who might have fallen for that sectarianism at that time are now seeing through the fog of war and recognizing, oh my goodness, all of these wars in the Middle East have been pushed by the United States and by Israel on purpose to keep us divided. I mean, it's an old colonial tactic of divide and conquer. And that's really what it comes down to. Now, some of the very people that might have even supported the U.S. proxy war in Syria are realizing that was a mistake and that was only serving the purpose of Israel and the United States. And I just want to remind people that while the Abraham Accords and this normalization relations are being, publicly talked about now, Israel has had relations with the Gulf countries for a very, very long time. I mean, the UAE has notoriously shared intelligence and tech with the state of Israel, and so has Saudi Arabia for over a decade. But now the normalization is just coming to surface publicly.
Let's talk about bias for a second. We all have biases. As a Muslim journalist, a Muslim American, I know that a lot of our values, our religion informs our worldview and the way we report on things, what we care about. Would you say that your ethnic background as a Palestinian has any element of emotion or bias in your reporting?
Absolutely. And I have no shame in saying that it does. As a Palestinian who is a victim of settler colonialism and US imperialism, there is a bias in the fact that I lived under war. And there's a bias in the fact that I watch the mainstream corporate media lie every single day about what's happening in Palestine. And that motivates me even more to speak my truth and to show people the realities of what life is like under war, and also to expose the many conflict of interest that exist within corporate media, because it is the media that manufactures consent for these wars. It is the media that acts as an arm, as a stenographer for the ruling military class to allow these crises and conflicts and regime change wars and so-called humanitarian wars to continue. It's these corporate media outlets that act as a mouthpiece for the ruling political class of the Democratic Party to allow for the transfer of millions of dollars worth of, if not billions of dollars worth of weapons to despotic regimes like the Israeli regime or the Saudi regime to continue. And so I use this bias that, having lived under war, motivates me to speak up more about these issues.
You spoke about how social media is really changing the game when it comes to exposing all these crimes that are happening in Gaza. I've seen this as a journalist where mainstream media is creating content that's targeted on social media to really keep up with that tide, because people are not watching, news on TV anymore. Do you think that they've made any improvement in the way they report, or it goes back to what you said is their agenda?
Well, I think, corporate media is very well funded, and they know that young people are accessing social media. And people, millions of people around the world, if not billions, get their news off of their smartphones. They're not going directly to the CNN app or the CNN website, excuse me, or the New York Times website. They're actually getting their news directly from social media platforms. And so they make their news in a way that's more soundbite friendly for people with short attention spans. And so this plays, it's a balance, trying to consume that news, because they're not always providing the proper context. There's no room for that. And so corporate media is criticized for that a lot. But also corporate media is playing into the soundbite, junk food, quick news culture of these big tech platforms that is really dumbing down our society and keeping people less and less informed. But there's also a backlash, like I said, with this war in Gaza, this genocide that's happening in Gaza, people are pushing back and demanding that more context is provided. And that pressure, it has actually worked. Even though corporate media breadcrumbs us once in a while with a proper investigation and news story about what's happening in Palestine, that pressure has helped them provide that context. But I think the really big issue that we're seeing is really the consolidation and the monopolization of the information that we have access to. The fact that big tech, which is Facebook, Google, YouTube, Meta, Instagram, all of these platforms, they are currently run by the national security state. And that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, we have at MintPress broken down and investigated and provided our reporting to showcase how former CIA agents, former FBI, even former Israeli military IDF soldiers from Unit 8200, a notorious intelligence unit within the Israeli military, hundreds of them work within these big tech platforms to spy on, monitor, collect information, and to control what people see, hear, and read on their news feeds. And so big tech is now an arm of the national security state. It's an arm of the Israeli military. It's an arm of the US military as well. And that's really what should be concerning to everybody. And so when people say, well, these are private organizations, it's like they still are basically representing the interests of the US government.
Wait, let's talk about the psychology of repetition for a second. You said that they use junk food type of sound bites to really keep putting out there. There's this the statement, do you support Hamas? Like, this is a thing that's being regurgitated everywhere. Why do you think there's such an emphasis on this question? Do you support Hamas?
Or is it, do you condemn Hamas and do you support Hamas? Like,
Yeah.
what, like
Yeah.
Piers Morgan famously.
The whole that same line. It's really out there. Like, even if you see like street journalists, they'll go up to people and they'll say, at Palestine rallies, like, do you condemn Hamas? Do you, why is the same line being repeated everywhere? What is the emphasis on it?
It's to, create borders in which we are allowed to talk about the crisis in Gaza. That's really as simple as it is. They want to make it about Hamas and not about the fact that Israel is a settler colonialist state, that Israel is committing genocide, that it's engaging in apartheid. It is being tried at the International Criminal Court for these crimes against humanity. It's committing war crimes. And so when this question is asked and we are bombarded with it, it is a distraction, and it is a way to corner us to only talk about the issues within the confines of that discussion about Hamas. And it puts people on the defense. And, I refuse to engage in that kind of conversation because it puts you in a corner where you can only talk about that from that perspective. And even that perspective, it's not the way in which Hamas is, or resistance is, even discussed. It's demeaned and it's dismissed, and it's from a U.S. State Department perspective.
I want to end on a very controversial note.
Okay.
Do you agree with people who say there's two camps, right? People who say that, any kind of coverage on Palestine is good coverage. Anyone who's really spreading the message and doing their part on their platforms, it's a great thing, and we should take whatever we can get. And then there are people who say we should we should avoid giving too much attention to, accounts like, for example, Khalid Beydoun or Sean King, um, because we should hear from Palestinians themselves who are reporting on ground. From a reporter's standpoint, like, where do you think the story placement should be from the masses themselves?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have one solid answer to give you, but I've seen a lot of people attack different
Different people,
people.
yeah.
Um,
It's very easy to cancel people in this day and age, I think.
yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that question, to be honest with you.
But do you believe that we should be placing the importance on, on ground reporters directly, like directly going to the source?
Okay, that makes more.
Mhm.
I can understand that question a little bit more. Um, Absolutely. I think we need to give a platform to the Palestinian journalists who are on the ground. I mean, Israel has currently targeted and killed over 140 Palestinian journalists since the crisis began. And so the voices of Palestinians who are marginalized, who are censored, who are being, targeted with these targeted assassinations, we have to give them the platform first. But we also invite other people and influencers to amplify their voices and the voice of the people that are on the ground. And I think we have to be careful with engaging with cancel culture. I don't support that kind of cancel culture. I think that if we are truly to be in a democratic society, we should also invite voices and perspectives that we don't necessarily agree with, and to be able to have discussions and open and honest conversations without having to cancel each other out. We have to trust ourselves to have a little bit more media literacy and critical thinking skills to be able to have those open and honest discussions. And, influencers should use their platforms to talk about Palestine and to give perspective and a voice to what's happening in Gaza. And we have to remember that everybody's capability is different. Like, what I can do as an investigative journalist might be different than somebody who's sitting at home raising 5 kids. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have 5 kids to raise, so I have a little bit more flexibility to do what I'm doing. So we have to really be careful about those judgments, to expect every single person to be at the forefront at every single protest and to be, bombarding all these representatives or to do everything. Everybody's has different capabilities, and we have to,
And different skills.
yeah, and different skill sets. So we have to be graceful, I think, with other people.
And I love that, because I think that, especially as a mother, like, I do strive to bring that concept of gentleness. We talk about gentle parenting, really bringing that grace into journalism as well. Like, I feel like as mothers, we do tend to bring a lot of those qualities in journalism, especially as women, as mothers. And even though, like, you're the face of, like, that, activist, speaking out against war, these are very harsh concepts, but with, tenderness, with grace, with in terms of even how we manage our own
Absolutely.
Culture in our media industries. That's very important. It goes a long way.
And I think, especially as mothers,
Yeah.
we have to remember that, yes, we are here in the cause to stop this genocide and stop all war, but we can never truly break the cycle of violence until we are very present with our children. And so a mistake that I have made is overworked myself, burning myself to the ground with the work that we're doing and not knowing when to take breaks because I was so emotionally attached to.
Because this work is unending. Every day there's a new story, and wars are endless.
They are endless, but we have to remember that, we can't come back home burnt out and agitated and stressed out and anxious and bring that back to our children, because especially if they're under the age of 7, their brains are still developing.
Mm.
And that's when their nurture and that part of their brain is their emotional development is taking place. And that's when they really need us to be as present and loving and nurturing to them as possible. And so if we are truly to break the cycle of violence and trauma, because I lived under Israeli occupation and war, so I want to break that cycle of trauma. That means I need to be more present with my kids while trying to balance doing what we do. And
so
really,
what you're saying is it all starts at home.
Yes.
It all starts at home. It's a beautiful interview. Thank you so much, Mnar, for joining us today, inspiring us with your words. I know we touched on some difficult things, so thank you for sharing and opening that part of your life with us. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'll see you next time.